Hey everyone, welcome back to another edition of Carallel's Caregiver Journey Webinar Series. I'm Matt Perrin, Director of Caregiver Engagement here at Carallel and former caregiver for my mom who was living with Alzheimer's disease, and my father-in-law who was living with Lewy body dementia. Today, these sessions are quick 30-minute discussions where we tackle sort of the everyday and difficult caregiving topics. And today we're talking about caring for a spouse or a partner. And I'm thrilled, beyond thrilled, to have a special guest for this discussion today. She's a caregiver for her husband, Tom, who's living with ALS. She holds a master's in health management and policy. Need to check my notes to make sure I get that right, as well as a master of public administration. She's held various positions in healthcare management and spent, I think, 13 years as an educator. And she's also, this is a long list of credentials here, but she's also a former fellow for the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, representing the state of North Carolina, where she advocated for nationally for military and veteran caregivers. If that's not enough, she's a published author and the co-host of this Caregiving Life podcast, Mary Hahn Ward. Hi, Mary. How are you?
Hi, I'm great. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Fantastic. Well, I'm thrilled to have you. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. First and foremost, if you've been in one of these sessions before, welcome back. Thanks for joining. If you haven't, just a quick bit on Carallel. We're a caregiver support company, and we support caregivers in two primary ways. First and foremost is with personalized, confidential human support from our care advocates on our caregiver support line. And we complement that human support with a digital platform that serves as a one-stop shop or caregiving hub for all your caregiving needs, storing documents, keeping friends and family up to date, educating yourself with loads of educational content. So human support and My Care Desk by Carallel, we provide to caregivers across the country through health insurance plans, employers, and healthcare systems. So just a quick bit on Carallel there. If you'd like more information, I can certainly provide that after the call. Secondly, if there are questions, we have a lot to get to today. If there are questions, comments, please do drop them in the chat in the console of your GoToWebinar. We'll do our best to address all of them here live in the session, and as always, any that we're not able to get to, we will get to in follow-up after the live session today. So I think, Mary, that's all of our housekeeping items. So today we're talking about spousal caregiving, and obviously something you have deep personal experience with. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspective. And before we jump in, I want to gauge sort of the audience. So we have a poll here, Mary, just to get a feel for what frame of mind the audience is coming to the conversation with. And today's question is, what about this topic prompted you to join today's webinar? Are you currently caring for a spouse or partner? Do you expect to soon have to be caring for a spouse or partner? Were you formerly caring for a spouse or partner? And I'm just curious for the future. So those are our options. I'm just taking an idea. So looks like 100%, Mary, 100% of the audience here today. We got about 60% of the vote in, and 100% I'm currently caring for my spouse or partner. So okay. That's very helpful.
Yes.
I'm going to go ahead and close out the poll. There we go, found the right button. So, you know, when thinking about this conversation today, Mary, it's such a broad topic. We have 30 minutes. You know, I thought it'd be, you know, we're always focused in these conversations on the practical, right? Real world, sort of real experience, talking about that and hopefully sharing perspectives, tips, tricks to you know, make our respective caregiving lives just a touch easier, right? If we can do that in these sessions, we consider it a win. So, you know, to provide a little bit of context, though, I thought it'd be interesting just to zoom out for a brief second And because when we're caring for a loved one, we're just, at least I'm so in the weeds, right? And we sometimes forget the magnitude of the societal challenge that caregiving can be, right? And so I thought I'd just frame that with some statistics. Some of these might be familiar to folks, but according to the National Caregiver Alliance and AARP study, Caregiving in the US report, there's about 53 million people in the US who are providing unpaid care to an aging, disabled, chronically ill, injured loved one. Those caregivers are providing on average 24.4 hours of care a week. Some maybe less, and lots probably a lot more than 24 hours per week. And nearly 1 in 4 of those caregivers are providing 41 hours or more of care a week, right? And then if you think about family caregivers who are living with the person they're caring for, those folks are providing on average 40.5 hours of care per week. And then just even more than that when we think about spousal caregivers. So, and then you add on to the fact that there's this blending of roles. When you're in a situation when you're caring for a spouse, you've spent your life with someone, and your primary role, of course, is spouse, partner, what have you, and then you have this new role that's really, really important, and sometimes it can be difficult to coexist. So, caregiving of all types is intense, but I'd imagine there's a different kind of intensity that comes with caring for our partner and spouse. What would you say to that, Mary? How do you react to that in terms of the different type of intensity?
That is so big. It's sometimes it's more insidious as a caregiver, for any caregiver in any line, in any lane with your children or with a parent, and with the spouse certainly as well. And that's what I'm here to talk about. And that insidious kind of caregiving can blend with your relationship, like with your partner relationship. And I think that sometimes is a challenge, because for me personally, I didn't see it. Even though I knew he was diagnosed with ALS, he was pretty independent for a long time. And I saw it blend over time, but sometimes it almost feels like it's too late, because I haven't taken the time to really assess how it was affecting my life. But I also do want to backtrack just a little bit, because I was his caregiver since 1993. He had a cognitive impairment from encephalitis, and I was young. I was in my 30s. He was 38, and our kids were 9 and 10 years old. And it was very different kind of caregiving, because in some ways, there was more hope in that he got better to a degree, and we worked toward independence. And I didn't really see myself as a caregiver until many years later, which was interesting for me to not see it that way. I was very busy, like finishing school and taking care of the kids, and anybody who's doing all of that at one time knows that that's one big blur. And there were times when I did feel like I was caring for a third child, and that did not go well in our marriage at times. That was a big insult when I said that. And I took it hard, but I reflected on it and thought, who would want to be told they're a child at 40 years old? Like nobody. So, it's one thing if I think it, I'm allowed to think what I want to think, but to have actually articulated it made it very difficult. So we had some really challenging years then. But then when he was diagnosed with ALS, we went the opposite. We have no future of independence. We have a future of more dependence. And so before you know it, you are an adult for two people all the time. And I think that's the hard blend that you have going on. Like where does caregiving begin and end, and where does your relationship as a partner begin and end?
Yeah, and it's so interesting to hear you talk about that, and I'm glad you sort of added additional context, because it's really, really interesting to hear that you had this earlier caregiving experience where you were, as you put it, collaboratively working towards independence, and then with ALS it's a different experience. And just something you said, in terms of you didn't identify as a caregiver. That could be a whole other topic, and actually will be for us. And that's something sort of woven deeply into the work that we do, is helping people realize that they're actually a caregiver, and that acknowledgement is sort of a sneaky big topic in my opinion. But I wanted to sort of in the balance that you mentioned between roles, I want to talk about specifically in just a minute. I thought organizing this conversation, wanted to look at 3 sort of common challenges that maybe have a different brand of intensity in a partner or spouse caregiving situation. And the first is isolation, right? And there's no secret about the dangers of isolation and the notion that isolation is often a real challenge for any caregiver, regardless of circumstance, regardless of who they're caring for. But I'm not a spousal caregiver myself, and I can imagine how isolation might just take on a different level of intensity when you're in a situation where you're caring for your spouse or partner. Can you talk a little bit about how that isolation challenge has manifested itself for you, and maybe share some tips on ways you've sort of coped or managed through the isolation piece?
Yeah, I can. I think that's a great topic because it affects us, even partners who are caregivers. Even among that group, it can affect us differently. And so what does isolation look for? Like, social media is a great outlet, but it is not always a good outlet. It can feel more isolating to be on social media. You can see, couples together and couples planning trips, and that we're not doing that anymore. I can't do that anymore. I'm older now. I'm 62, and I think I'm in great shape, but I covet that I'm in great shape, but don't really want to test what it takes for me to travel. I know what it takes for us to travel, and we've done it, and I'm not willing to put my body through that anymore. And so that alone can feel very isolating for me. So I have a small group that I will reach out to and talk to on the phone. So it's not, in a big group or necessarily a support group, which is not for me, but I'm not saying that it's not good for other people. I think it can be wonderful for other people. Many people really thrive in a support group because they're hearing the stories of other people and they're relating to what's happening in their lives. There are still times, so many years I've been a caregiver, and there's still the acknowledgement that there are times when I feel in isolation. Sometimes I feel it when, like, on a holiday, when people, because of his cognitive impairment, he might forget that there's a holiday. Well, actually, he really always forgets there's a holiday. So he does lots of nice, beautiful things during the year, but he'll forget there's a holiday, and somebody will say to me, my husband got me, blah, 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 and it was so nice, and I was so surprised. And I think, well, I didn't get anything, and like, even though I get things the rest of the year, and even though I've really accomplished so much in really reducing the feelings of isolation, I still feel it. That's the human part of it. And now I acknowledge it. And so let me get to the part about how I handle it and why I handle it better now. A year ago, actually just this month, a year ago, I took a very deep dive into meditation and mindfulness. I had been curious about it for years. I'd done yoga for years. I had done some meditation, but I really wanted to know, what in the heck is this mindfulness thing? What is everybody talking about? And so I took a course online that was live. It was not asynchronous. So we could interact and I could learn. And I took like a little 4-week course with that, and then I took a longer one so that I could really learn it. And it has been my saving grace, because even when I feel like a little put out that we're not retiring, and you and I have talked about that, when I retire, it means Tom has died. So we're not planning big trips. We're not planning any big future for ourselves. We plan for today. And we plan a little bit for tomorrow, and we might plan a little bit for the summertime, but that's just very small little plans that we have going on. But the big picture of retirement is not here. So when I feel that way, I can go back to my mindfulness training. I can go back to my breath work. I can go back to some quiet in my mind, and then I really do feel better.
There's a lot here that I'm kind of making mental notes as you're talking, and thank you so much for sharing in this way. I think it's, the personal perspective is really Really, really important. So I want to go back to something you said at the beginning, though, when you were talking. So sort of what I think of as like the obvious isolation, right? Actually being isolated, and you know, not around people, not able to do things that maybe you've done in the past or want to be doing. And you mentioned you have a group of people that you'll talk to on the phone. Are those friends from? How did you meet those people? Who are those people? You know, are they people that you met through caregiving? Are they friends from just life? Who are they? Just a few seconds on that, I think, would be
Yeah,
helpful.
they're caregivers, and you know, they're fellows from the Elizabeth Dole Foundation. We're really never former fellows. We're alumni, and we're very
Yeah.
busy and very active as alumni as well. And that's who the ones that I will reach out to now, because I can count on not being judged by them. And I think that that's the most important feeling for me, is
Got
if
it.
you're going to judge me or give me a long list of things that I could do to feel less isolated or lonesome, I've probably done them all anyway. So, but if you're a caregiver friend, you're not likely to give me that.
Right. No, I agree, and I share that sentiment for sure. So then one other thing that you mentioned was, or the other part of your comments was, in my head, I was perceiving it as sort of indirect isolation, which is, you know, whether it be something like looking at social media or hearing about what other people are doing or planning or this, that, the other thing. And that's a really good, I hadn't thought of isolation in that point. So thank you for mentioning that. And the mindfulness is a really, you know, it's just something I've never done, but it sounds like it's really helped you. So I'd be curious to anybody in the audience is actively practicing any type of breathing exercises or mindfulness. Like you, I've been thinking about it, curious about it for a while, Mary, but I've just never gotten to it. And support groups, your point on support groups, totally agree. I have one that I really like, that I still participate in. Others just haven't worked for me, and you know, you hit the nail on the head from my perspective, Mary, and that's just a really personal thing, right? So I think the message is, you know, it's about us as caregivers having sort of the taking the initiative, I guess, to protect ourselves, which sounds, it can be difficult at times. It has been for me, certainly. But second, I'm noticing the clock. So big topic, and you alluded to this at the beginning, sort of the other big sort of scenario we hear often about from spousal caregivers on our caregiver support line is sort of just the general balancing of the two roles, right? Spouse and partner on one side, that's familiar, that's your life, right? And then you have this new role, caregiver. You know, can you talk a little bit about just how you balance it? And
I think that's a tough one, because again, that's kind of like support groups. It's, you know, it's not one size fits all. There's many different ways to reduce the anxieties and the stresses that we have in our life, and no caregiver should ever feel like they have to do it any particular way. They need to do it their way, and they need to not be afraid to walk away from something that isn't working for themselves. And so the same thing, I think really what we're getting at is like the intimacy part of our relationship. And I have my husband to thank for this. Tom really thinks of our relationship as we're partners first, and I'm a caregiver second, and he's a care recipient second. He's not defined by ALS. He's not defined by his cognitive impairment, and I'm not defined by caring for him. And so the most important thing we have to do is nurture our marriage as we would even if we didn't have those other things in our life. And so for us, that means having time for coffee together. There's lots of ways of being intimate. And I think that you have to break the barrier in our own minds for that. Like some people think that's just sex, and that's not necessarily the thing. And that can be difficult with some of the, you know, with Alzheimer's, people who have had strokes. Parkinson's. There's so many different ALS. It all can be very difficult, even physically. And that's something, that open communication, I think, is the most important thing to maintain some intimacy. I'm finding intimacy in different colors in your life. You know, like there's a palette of intimacy. Do we have coffee together in the morning? When Tom does respiratory care later in the day, that's basically what we call it. He spends 2 hours in his hospital bed on his breathing machine, and it helps him revive himself for the rest of the evening. Sometimes I get back in and I just sit there with him, and it's very squishy because it's only like a hospital-sized bed, but I get under the blankets and I sit with him and I hold his hand and we talk, and that's a very intimate moment that I'm happy to share here, because I think that if you know that that's what I call intimacy, maybe you can find something that feels intimate to you as well.
Right. Well, I'm glad you must have been reading minds, because we had a question come in on intimacy and just more broadly redefining certain aspects of the relationship, which it strikes me as what you're talking about. You know, when you're talking specifically about intimacy, what I'm hearing from you is just well, I'm hearing a few things, but the one of the main threads is just this redefinition of what that means, with ourselves first, but also together as a unit with our partner. And then the other piece you called out appropriately was the key way to do that is through communication, which sounds simple and easy. And, you know, as caregivers, you know, I certainly have been challenged with communication throughout my journey. I can imagine that's difficult. You know, it sounds like you're fortunate in the sense of Tom being open and communicating in the way that he does, giving you the space to sort of truly work together on this. I mean, we sometimes hear from folks who don't necessarily have you know, that level of communication and open-mindedness in the face of a caregiver.
I don't know. I think that for people who struggle with that communication piece, I think that as the caregiver and the spousal partner, that you have to step forward and try different things that feel like this could be intimacy for us, and then maybe that doesn't work. Maybe like climbing back in the bed with them doesn't work, or getting up and having a cup of coffee on the front porch, just the two of you, doesn't feel that way. I think you have to be bold, not be afraid to try different things, and try not to get your feelings hurt when they don't work, or let your feelings get hurt, but be able to move on. And that would be circling all the way back to the mindfulness part of my life, where I can take it better. And I'm also gotten better because of mindfulness, to be able to say, hey, listen, I'm just being honest here. I've really lost my patience right now.
Yeah.
Everything. And I've repeated myself 4 times in the last half hour. And you're either not listening or you're not following it. And if it's not your fault, that's fine. But I still have lost my patience. And I need to stop.
I appreciate you sharing that. And that's a good segue to the third sort of common challenge, which is around sort of compassion fatigue, burnout, you know, faces that we're all faced by it at some point, no matter what our caregiving situation is. Again, I can imagine it just being a different level of intensity in a spousal caregiving situation. I mean, do you have times when you feel like that? B, how do you manage through them? I'd imagine you fall back again on some of your mindfulness and just communication with Tom. Is that how you handle it?
Yes, well, I've created in the last few years, I've really gotten very good at creating boundaries, even with Tom and I, boundaries of, I exercise almost every morning. I've lost a lot of weight in the last 3 years. And it's really important to me to have that time, and I just make the time. And if I can't have that time because he needs care all the time, then we'll have care in the house. I'm always going to do that. It's that important to me, because I'm as important as he is. And a lot of people will say, you have to be good and take care of yourself so you can take care of the person you're caring for. And I totally understand why people say that, but it's a really, it can be a really negative message. Take care of yourself because you're important. You are every bit as important as a person you're caring for. And as hard as that is, you need to have as good a life as you can as well. So I have boundaries, and I did a podcast on that with boundaries on this Caregiver Life. And I think it's one of the most important things we do is we have to have our boundaries. Like, hey, I need to have my space right now, whatever that means for you. And in the beginning, I think all those things are really hard to figure out. But over time, you get to be pretty seasoned with it. And if it's important to you, then I think that you're going to do it. Find what's important to you.
Yeah, I see a question just on boundaries. So how, because I've struggled with it as well. How, when did you, in your journey, it's been years, obviously, when did you figure that piece out about the boundaries? Is a question from the audience.
You know, I think without using the word boundaries, I think I created it very early on in the 1990s. I had just returned to school, to college. The kids were 9 and 10, and then he got sick after that. And I stayed in school, and I could have left. I mean, I had every reason to. Our life was like, was such a mess on so many levels. But I stayed in school, and I think that was one of my boundaries, because my most favorite phrase back then was, I really can't do that right now because I have to go do my homework. And I really think that was a boundary for me, because nobody would cross the line. You know, mom's doing her schoolwork. And I think that was a boundary. And that was a boundary for years, because look at all the school I did. I did all of that in the 1990s. I was like addicted to going to school because it always gave me permission to have time to myself.
Interesting. I can't imagine. I'm just thinking of my own experience when I was the age that you described with family, and I can't imagine. So it's interesting to hear how you reflect on school at that point as sort of one of the first boundaries you set for yourself. Well, really, really helpful. I guess we're at time. I apologize for the technical difficulties. Life happens. What parting thoughts would you share with the audience? We know actually the vote finished at about 50-50. I'm just curious for the future, and I'm currently caring for a spouse. So what parting thoughts might you share with the audience?
Well, what comes to mind as soon as you said that is to not feel guilty about wanting time for yourself, about taking care of yourself, or for the situation you're in. Unless you deliberately cause your partner to be injured in life, you have nothing to feel guilty for. I did nothing in my life to give my husband a cognitive impairment, encephalitis, or ALS. Yeah. And I don't feel guilty about it. And I don't feel guilty about taking some time for myself. I don't know that I ever felt guilty about it, but I know a lot of caregivers who do tend to feel guilty that they're enjoying things and their person they're caring for is not. And I just think that that's just a part of life. That happens. I would not want anybody who's caring for me, if that becomes part of my life later on, to ever feel guilty about any of it. You still get to enjoy your life, whatever part of it that you can enjoy.
I love it. I'm certainly going to take that to heart. I hope the audience does as well. Thank you everybody for joining. Mary, thanks so much for joining me and having this conversation. Really, really appreciate it. Hope you'll be able to join us for our next session, which is on Wednesday, June 29th at 12 o'clock Eastern. We'll be talking about solving our transportation challenges that stem from caregiving. So hope y'all can join us then. And Mary, thanks again.